Hello, my name is Ike McKinley, and this is NOS 220, Linux System Administration. For this lesson, we'll be taking a look at how to set up networking in a Linux environment and how to best use networking configuration for security and availability. We'll look at network devices, IP addressing, and network ports, tools for networking management, and some common network server applications that are used in Linux. The basics of Linux networking involve several layers. At the very bottom, there are the network devices, each of which can support multiple network addresses, and each address supports about 65,000 network ports. Each of these layers is manipulated by several network management tools, and the entire infrastructure supports several common network applications. In Linux, network devices are character devices found in the /sys directory and discovered by the HAL and UDEV systems. Those systems are outside the scope of this video, but the end result is visible using the ifconfig-a command, which lists all active network devices. Most network devices that work in Linux have drivers included in the kernel. Any devices that are not automatically recognized will often include drivers in the install media. Linux network structures include both wired and wireless adapters, but the latter require the iwconfig tool to set the proper parameters. In general, any newly discovered adapters will default to automatically configure themselves on the network. The most common reason that this fails is a lack of a driver for the particular network hardware involved. It's also possible that the network itself is misconfigured, but again, this is somewhat outside the scope of this lesson. Assuming then that you have a properly configured network, you can still manually set IP addressing yourself. So let's move on to see just how IP addresses work. To assign a network address, you need to set 4 variables: the IP address of the machine, the net mask, the default gateway, if you want to access more than just the local network anyway, and the domain name server. The current IP addressing system is IP version 4, which uses 4 8-bit numbers from 0 to 255 for each IP address, separated by a period, thus created what is called a dotted quad address. This creates an address like 156.45.201.188, which is combined with what is called a net mask, which is another dotted quad. The net mask is used to identify what part of the network address is the local network, which are all the addresses that can be reached without going through a gateway address. Usually a net mask is divided along the dot boundaries. So a net mask of 255.255.0.0 would mean that the above address would regard any address starting with 156.45 as part of a local network. If the net mask were extended out another dot, say 255.255.255.0, then the addresses beginning with 156.45.201 would be part of the network. The network address is therefore the IP address of the machine combined with the net mask, with the zeros in the net mask replacing part of the IP address. Thus, a net mask of 255.255.0.0 would produce a network address of 156.45.0.0. And again, the longer net mask address of 255.255.255.0 would produce 156.45.201.0. Both the IP address and the network are set with the ifconfig command. And if you only need to access the local network without domain names, then this is pretty much all you need to know. However, if you need to reach addresses outside the local network, you must designate a gateway address. This is a machine that is a router connected to a larger network in some way. The gateway address must be part of the local network. So in our current example, a typical gateway address would be something like 156.45.1.1 for the first network and 156.45.201.1 for the second. The route command both displays the gateways and allows you to set them. Finally, if you want to use domain names to reach other machines, rather than only being able to access machines via their IP addresses, you need to set a domain name server. These are usually on the local network, but they don't need to be if you have a default gateway already set up. If you are part of a larger network, then your network administrator can provide the IP addresses of the DNS servers. Otherwise, your ISP should have this information. Also, bear in mind that you will need to use the IP addresses to designate the named servers. DNS servers are set by adding lines to the text file /etc resolve.conf. Each IP address also has 65,536 ports. A port is usually used for a single connection, and various server processes attach themselves to certain ports. Ports beneath 1024 are considered private ports and are usually reserved for a particular server or process. For instance, port 80 is used for web servers, whereas SSH uses port 22 and email uses port 25. Many servers respond using text, so a telnet program connecting to a particular port can be used to manually test a server by connecting to that port. In addition to the ifconfig and route commands, the netstat command will list all of the active network connections, as well as ports where a server is listening for a connection. Using netstat with the TMP switch will show all TCP connections and the processes that are using them. Netstat can be a critical tool when dealing with a network server and is usually the first step when diagnosing network issues. Another highly useful utility is the TC command. Although this is somewhat complicated to cover in detail, the command stands for traffic control and allows the network to limit network traffic using multiple schemes and filters by port, source address, or a number of other rules. Even in its simplest form, TC is useful for limiting network traffic and balancing access while doing so. So, today we've looked at a Linux networking environment, including network devices, IP addressing, and some network configuration and management tools. Next, we'll be examining Linux hardware configuration and management.